a short passage from Patient, which I wrote in the 90s. And then we're going to have a chat, and then I'll read a little bit from Romany and Tom midway through. But this is a short passage from Patient. Artificially nourished and doped up with drugs, I noticed my hair start to fall out. In the mornings, there would be a fine carpet of it on my pillow, and strands would be left hanging from my fingers if I ran my hand through it. I let it grow and swept it back. Audrey, Tracy's mum, said she never knew I had naturally wavy hair. She said I was very lucky. I let my beard grow too. I felt like Robinson Crusoe, and cornily imagined myself romantically tossed by fate, resolute and adaptable. Sometimes I'd ask my mother for the mirror she kept in her handbag and hold it up to my face and see a man I didn't recognize with soft, serious eyes. It was a face of shadows and hollows and of something learned. When I was allowed to go to the bathroom to wash myself, I would stand in front of the mirror and look at that same face for minutes on end, and would always feel strangely respectful, and would quietly say, "Keep going," impressed by the patience I saw reflected, and my eyes would burn back at me. I noticed how the weather and the outside world held no interest for me. The weather was for other people, out there in their offices and one-roomed flats, their garden sheds and their caravans, for people running for cover on the rain-spattered streets or tramping through the summer's thick, sulphurous city air. Tracy and my mum would comment on it, even after a 2-minute stroll to the pub, or the nurse's home canteen, how it was mild or muggy, or close, or fresh. It altered their moods. Summer mornings in ITU brought Tracy in wearing summer dresses, her bountiful eyes full of hope and light. Humid afternoons meant my mother sitting by a window tugging at the shoulders of her shirt, nurses sighing, a languor of stillness that brought a clock-stopping torpidity to the hours after lunch. The newspaper reports lost their importance too. Corruption scandals raged, whole countries were imploding, but more often than not, I closed the page simply too listless or self-centered to pay attention. And even when the Test cricket was being broadcast on my transistor radio, something I often look forward to, I found myself drifting away into myself, or I'd let the earpiece fall onto the pillow, and Tracy would lean over and pick it up and put it back, and I would just shrug indifference and roll my head back into the middle of the pillow, hoping for nothing more than a comfortable indentation in the polyester filling, so that I wouldn't have to move or lift my head for half an hour, and so avoid using the muscles down in my belly where I'd had the operations. I couldn't care. I couldn't care at all, much of the time, about anything. And from this quiet disengagement came self-absorption. As I watched and listened out for myself, I regularly seemed to leave myself and become egoless, free-floating, non-doing, motionless but for my eyes flicking and blinking, like a lizard on a rock, basking in the alcohol-like fug of Voltarol, or the pleasure of being temporarily released from the effects of drugs or pain, until my bedridden arse would ache again and I'd have to move, pinching my buttocks together, lifting my pelvis off the mattress, uncrossing my feet to find my calf muscles had gone to sleep again. And maybe another hour would have passed. I would have slumped, my back no longer cushioned in the plump pillows, but cross-braced over the bed, a creaking ship's timber, my neck impacted into the top pillow, like the straw in a packing case. And if I was feeling strong, I would reach up for the monkey bar above my head and haul myself upright until my back was straight, and I was sitting on my sitting bones, my legs stretched out in front of me like a child, my head loosed and freed, a periscope, cool air passing behind me. And in these hours, often with Tracy silently reading, I felt no anger or resentment, no festering rage at such seeming injustice, at such a seeming non-life. For the question, why me, only begs the question, why anyone? And the interior world I began to inhabit was not a landscape of fear and stress and acrimony, but one where a recognition of my frailty and mortality fed a kind of strength. It felt stylish to be so unwell. I was important to people, to Tracy, my family, surgeons and doctors. And I felt I had the scoop on life and death, and everyone else was still running around after it. And should death have come nearby again, as it did when I was on ITU, I would have felt I had slipped under its net once, and perhaps I would do so again, nonchalantly, with a degree of flair. Thank you.
As I said to you earlier, after reading this book, we get a sense that we know you extremely well. You talking very graphically about your bowels. Maybe we should back up and actually explain what it is, Church-Strauss.
Church-Strauss is it's a very rare autoimmune disease, which when it was discovered in me had only been seen in about 40 people since the Second World War. And what happens is the immune system becomes hypersensitive and starts to attack your own body tissue. You become autoimmune. In some ways it's not dissimilar to other autoimmune illnesses like lupus and other things that may be a little more famous. But in my case it was incredibly extreme. It attacked a part of my body that was very unexpected. It's often seen in the lungs or in the heart. With me, it was my small intestine, which confused doctors. But basically, it destroyed 75% of my small intestine. And I was in hospital for 3 weeks before they really worked out what was going on. And I had every test possible for multi-system disorder. And in the end, they just cut me open. They just called the surgeons and said, we don't know what it is. He says it's a pain in his stomach. Cut him open. And they discovered that most of my intestine had rotted away inside me through vasculitis, which is the last stage of Church-Strauss. So I was then sedated, and I spent about a week unconscious on intensive care and had 5 life-saving operations in a week, where they basically took out my small intestine piece by piece, trying to leave as much of it as possible behind. And once it stabilised and they managed to get the drugs correct to keep my immune system from doing it again, I was then in hospital for a further 6 weeks, recovering. And I came out, I think most people have about 20 feet of small intestine to digest their food, and I have a little less than 3 feet now, so there we go. But I'm here, and I've had 3 kids since then. Written some books and made some records. And, yeah.
You were 29 at the time, right?
I was 29, yeah.
And in fact, the greatest success that you had musically all came after that. It was...
That's true. I think on a global level that's very true. I mean, we had a successful career in the UK and to some extent in some European territories in the 80s, and then we had a bit of a dip, like a lot of bands have after their 4th or 5th album. A new generation comes along and you seem like yesterday's news. And then I got sick, which seemed to draw a line under all of it. But then we sort of reinvented ourselves in the 90s with a whole new sound and came back for another generation of listeners.
I'd like to get to that in a bit, but just first about the book. When you this happened in 1992, the summer of 1992. The book came out in 1996. Were you keeping contemporaneous notes at the time? How did you write it? Was it all recollection? Or?
The first, I think, 6 months after I came home was very difficult. I was basically looked after on the state health system in the UK, on the NHS. They were absolutely fantastic, and I have nothing but praise for them, but they don't offer much aftercare. And when I was released, I had basically suffered a terrible mental trauma, and I became very internalised. I was not given any support. I didn't have any therapy of any kind. I found it very hard to interact with Tracy, who I'd been very close to for many years, with my own family. And in the end, to get it out of my system, I just started to write things down. That old thing, if you can name it, you can tame it. And I just really started writing randomly things that I remembered. And what that did was that actually unlocked my songwriting. And then I put those notes down, and we went off and recorded that record that you referred to earlier on, Amplified Heart, which contained the song Missing, which then took up quite a bit of our time because it was a successful record and we had a comeback of some sort. And then I went back to the notes I'd written for Patient, and suddenly realised I'd written 30,000 words, which was about a third of the book. And I thought, there's something here. It suddenly struck me very fresh, what I'd written. And I just went back and thought I could make something of it, and then I wrote the book very quickly in about 1995.
And what kind of response did you get to it from fans, from other people maybe who have the Church Strauss? Or other...
Well, the first thing was I thought I needed an agent. I thought I didn't know anything about the publishing world. And I literally went to my local Waterstones bookstore and I bought a book on how to become a writer. And I just looked in the back, and in the back there was a glossary of current London-based agents. So I just sent a copy of the book to the 4 or 5 who looked the most interesting. And one of them was David Godwin, who'd been at Jonathan Cape and was just setting up as an agent. And he got back to me almost immediately, saying he really, really liked the book. And I said, well, look, let's meet. And I liked him and we got on. And I said, look, find me a publisher, but on one condition, that you don't tell them who wrote it. I'd really like it just to be sold on the basis of it being like an everyman story, not a celebrity memoir. And he thought that was a real interesting challenge. And Penguin were one of the first people to read it, and Tony Lacey at Penguin really liked it as well, and bought it pretty much with no backstory at all. And only then was told that it was me, which of course made him doubly pleased because it gave him a bit of an angle when it came to the marketing. But I think that was the point of the book. And I don't really talk very much about being a musician or being in the band at all in the book. I hardly ever refer to it because that wasn't really the point.
So and what kind of response did you get even then from readers, well or sick or others? Did they feel that you captured what they've gone through?
I think it was a mixture. I mean, obviously, I'd been in the public eye for a couple of years before, and I'd been incredibly thin. I mean, I went into hospital weighing, I'm trying to think of this in American terms, I was over 12 stone, which is 140 plus 30, about 170 pounds or something, and came out and I was more like 120 pounds. I lost 50 pounds while I was in hospital. And I was like rake thin. And lots of people were asking questions. You know, what's wrong with Ben? Why is he like this? So I think a lot of people were relieved to hear the story, and then I was basically better. But I don't know. I didn't really talk to people about it at the time. It just, the album came out, the book came out. I was busy. It was well received. I was very pleased. You know.
One of the things that is very striking about it, if this was, not to be cliche, but if this was in the United States, or an American writing this book, there would probably be, being at death's door, some reference to theology in some way, to God in some way. and it's completely absent, with one reference to Tracy going by the chapel, but we don't even know why she's there. Someone could write this book and make references to Job or that kind of thing, and you don't. You know, there's sort of like the atheist in the foxhole or hospital bed. Was that something deliberate, or was it just absolutely not on your plane at all?
Well, it was a very common question, especially when I first came out and was publicising the book. One of the most common questions was, did you have a spiritual experience?
Right.
You know, you were that close to death more than once. And there is one period I describe in the book towards the end when I was about to be allowed home, and then I suffered a terrible bout of septicemia, and my temperature went up and up and up in the course of a couple of hours one morning. And it's the most vivid memory I have of being very close to letting go, and very much had that sense of being down the wrong end of a telescope, and all the doctors were around my bed, and I had a sense that I could quite easily just lean back another few inches and that would be it. And it didn't seem at all like a big deal, but somehow I chose to crawl back up the telescope and get out the other end. I don't know why, but I did. But I didn't really have any kind of spiritual experience at all when I was in hospital. If anything, I had the absolute opposite. And I was driven very much into the complete physicality of myself. Just me and my body going wrong in this bed. And how could I deal with it? How could I make it comfortable? How could I improve its situation by doing what the doctors wanted, by having the tests when they asked? You know, it was a very sort of corporeal, physical experience, and the thought of God or some spiritual plane just was not there at all, for me anyway.
And that's actually what I wanted to ask you about. Is you clearly know your body better, having gone through this, even 20 years ago, better than most people probably do because of this experience. What is that like, number one? And what has happened since 1996, since the writing of the book, in terms of how you've dealt with syndrome?
Well, I have two things I live with now. One is the actual syndrome itself, which is this hypersensitivity in the immune system, and I take medication every day to keep my immune system at a kind of normal level. If I didn't take these drugs, which I take on a daily basis, it would probably escalate and go hypersensitive again and attack a different part of my body. They tried modulating the drugs about 10 years ago to a lower level, and they saw it coming back in my lungs. And they managed to see it very quickly. They hit me hard with some drugs over 48 hours and it calmed down again. So there's that side of it, which the drugs agree with me. They're not the nicest drugs in the world to take. You know, they're cytotoxic drugs, which are kind of cancer patient drugs, but I live with them and I don't have any side effects, so that's good. But then the second thing I have is the mechanical problem of just having lost so much of your small intestine, which anybody would have had they lost it in, I don't know, stomach cancer or a road accident or something. So my diet is very compromised. I find it very hard to digest fat and also fibre, because these are the two things that the intestine works hardest on. Fibre everybody needs with a normal intestine because it helps flush you through all your spinach and your pulses and your beans, but that's the last thing I need. And fat is the other thing that's very hard to digest. Creams, butters, oils, doesn't matter what they are. It can be the extra virgin olive oil, it can be cheap trans fat margarine, it's all fat. So I keep that at kind of low levels as well. But I eat a pretty healthy diet. I mean, I eat chicken and fish and, you know, fruit, rice, white breads, vegetables with a lot of water content in them. You know, it's pretty healthy.
As you mentioned, in actually in neither book, we'll get to the second one soon, you don't really talk that much specifically about your music career. It's sort of ancillary to the books. And so that got me very curious about some of these questions of, you know, how did you, and you mentioned how you and Tracy met because you're both in the same record label, she with a band, you solo. But when did you start learning, when did you start getting interested in playing music yourself? You're the son of a jazz musician, but when did you begin to learn to play? And what were those early years with her like?
Well, I was the youngest in my family by quite a long time. I was the only child of a second marriage, and the children from my mother's first marriage, we all shared the same house. My father was their stepfather, but there was 10-year difference between me and my half-brothers and sisters. So I grew up in a very kind of musically advanced situation. My father, as you rightly say, was a jazz musician. There was jazz playing all the time downstairs in the living room. You know, Count Basie, Charlie Parker, Roland Kirk, Bill Evans, you know, this was on all the time. And then upstairs in the upper bedrooms, each room was like a different radio station for my different brothers and sisters. And they all had different tastes. So one brother liked Roy Harper and kind of obscure British folk music. One of my other brothers had more mainstream taste and liked James Taylor and Paul Simon. My sister she was in with the art college crowd, and she liked Lou Reed and stuff like that. So this was all playing in my house. And then my mother was a journalist in her second career, and used to get sent albums, because she was a showbiz writer. And the albums were offered round the family after she'd written about them, or if she hadn't written about them. And if nobody wanted them, they came to me, because I was the youngest and the last. And I remember being given stuff that was rejected by the rest of the family, and was given Neil Young's Decade triple album from 1976, like a distillation of his career. I didn't know who this guy was. There was a photograph of somebody on a beach with his arms outstretched with a guitar case. Do you know that picture?
Yeah, I have the album.
Yeah. And I just, as a 14-year-old, I listened to that inside out, and it was my record, and loved that. An older friend at school introduced me to John Martin, British folk, jazz, guitar, and that really connected with me. My dad had played me Grant Green and Joe Pass and all these jazz guitarists, but John Martin was a kind of link for me into the contemporary age. He seemed to be taking jazz into folk, and that was something I could respond to. So all this was in my head when I went to university, aged 18, and met Tracy. And she had a completely different upbringing. She was just a straightforward suburban girl. She'd gone to discos. She'd hung out with local punk bands. You know, her dad listened to a bit of vocal jazz, Ella Fitzgerald, Frank Sinatra. She was more kind of pop. And we came together and we just kind of merged our common interests. And that was how we came up with the band, really.
How soon was it evident that you wanted to do something? I mean, you could have formed a larger band with the two of you and other musicians, or stayed separately. And so what was it about when did you begin to play music together and say, oh, there's something to this?
Well, when we met, Tracy was already in her first band, which she'd formed straight out of school, well, almost at school, the Marine Girls, which was a three-piece, lo-fi, all-girl band, which had a kind of inept charm to them, with these incredibly spiky lyrics. They were later name-checked as one of Kurt Cobain's favourite ever bands in his diaries. And they'd become a kind of sort of cult band from that period. So Tracy was quite wrapped up with that. And I had this early solo career where I was playing this kind of slightly folky, jazzy guitar. I was chasing down my icons, my idols. My first single was produced by Kevin Coyne, who was this folk blues maverick from the UK. I then chased down Robert Wyatt, who played on my EP when I was only 19. And when we came together to record the first Everything But the Girl EP, it was throwaway. Someone at the record label said, well, you're living in the same town. Make a record together. So we chose a throwaway name, Everything But the Girl. It seemed quite humorous. And we made an EP thinking we'd be together for 3 months. And then it was a success, and we ended up 20 years doing it. So.
Can you tell us a little bit about that kind of heady time then, when, you know, or at least I started to hear about you all the way on campus towns in the United States? I mean, what was that experience like, as you said earlier, having that kind of success in Europe and UK, and then...
Well, in terms of American audiences, we were very much a kind of underground college band. You know, we didn't have any success to speak of in America. We were signed to Sire Records, which was kind of cool, but we didn't really sell any records. I just noticed there's a film out just this week, Greg Araki's new movie, White Bird in a Blizzard. Have you seen that movie that's just coming out this week? And that, the whole soundtrack of that is very much that 80s British band period, because he was a huge fan of ours from that time. So we're on the soundtrack, and there's The Cure and the Cocteau Twins and Love and Rockets and all these kind of bands from that period. But we stayed at that level for the first 5 years in terms of American audiences, whereas you're right, in Europe we had a lot more success. Italy particularly really took to our sound. We had a couple of big records in Italy and back in the UK. And then with our fifth record in 1990, the tide was turning in the UK generationally. We decided to make a stab at America, and we went out and recorded an album in LA with a whole bunch of crack American session musicians. And we actually made a successful record, but it was with a sound that we didn't quite feel comfortable with. It was too slick. And we suddenly found ourselves getting played on all these kind of slick American radio stations and embraced as a new band in this kind of pop, soul, jazz thing, and it felt a little bit alien to our alternative roots. So there is a crowd who remembers us from that album, The Language of Life. Then I was ill, then we reinvented our sound, and that's kind of probably where you remember us most clearly. We came back with... When I was sick and we started to make music again, I think we felt we'd kind of backed ourselves into a corner musically. We felt it's inevitable. Bands grow older. Your audience grows older with you. And often they grow more conservative. They want to sit down at the gigs. They want to hear the old stuff. They don't really want to hear the fifth and the sixth album. They want to hear the stuff they grew up with. And it feels quite claustrophobic. And I remember me and Tracy really thinking, if we're going to come back after my illness, we want to just break the mold somehow. Let's do something really contemporary. And we decided to embrace electronica, which was very much the sound of the age. And fortunately, Tracy's voice sat very comfortably with those kind of arrangements. And we found a whole new crowd, really.
And how much did that, you kind of alluded to this, but how did everything you went through with the illness and writing the book change your approach to songwriting? Did it, or is the album title Walking Wounded a reference to that?
Well, I think that's true. I think from Amplified Heart and Walking Wounded, there's a certainly a real immediacy to the lyrics. I think if we backed ourselves into a corner lyrically in the years preceding it, perhaps our lyrics had become a little too considered, a little too glib, perhaps, neat endings, a final verse with a resolution to the problem stated in verse 1. And I think perhaps after my illness, there were a lot more songs that were about, I feel like this right now, and there's no answer. Which I think gave them quite an adolescent appeal, which partly explains the regeneration of our audience. They were a little less thought out. And they had a real urgency to them, I think. So I think that's probably the difference.
Would you like to read from Romany and Tom?
Sure. So this is a book I wrote in 2012 about my parents, Romany and Tom. And as we were saying earlier on, it's quite a long book, and it covers my period growing up with them as a child, and then as an adult myself, with children of my own, relating to them as adults, and then with them getting much older and suddenly the roles reversing, and me becoming their carer. And the story flits back and forth in time, telling the parallel story of my parents' last 5 years, when they'd really lost control of their lives and I was in charge, in parallel with this backstory of my growing up with them. But this passage I'd like to read is me reflecting early on in the book, my growing up with my parents, and I'm probably about 7 or 8 at this point in the book, and this is the late 60s. Back then, my dad kept his piano in their bedroom, but I didn't often hear him play it. Or sometimes he would start playing it, and then I'd hear him stop. In the afternoons, he'd go in there to work, and I might hear the key turn in the lock on the inside, and the creak of the double bed as he lay down, and he seemed to stay in there a long time in silence. In the holidays or at weekends, I might be down in the garden playing on my own, and I would look up at his bedroom window and notice that the curtains weren't drawn, which led me to believe he couldn't have been asleep, and I used to wonder what he must be doing in there. I came to the conclusion that he must be doing a lot of thinking. And then one day I came home from school on a clear late autumn afternoon, and there was a different atmosphere in the flat. I could hear notes from the piano as I came up the stairs to the flat door. I went into the kitchen. My mum was bright and her face looked like someone had turned a light on inside it. She was arranging a cup and saucer on a tea tray. "Tea for the thirsty worker," she chimed. "You can pop your head round the door, but don't stay long. So much to do." I gently pushed open the bedroom door. Behind it, a black gate-leg table had been set up at right angles to the small brown upright piano. A fresh ream of manuscript had been cracked open. Black and red striped dark 2B pencils lay ready in a row next to an eraser. There was a steel sharpener, a tuning fork, and a long wooden ruler that was 4 times the length of the pocket one I took to school. More manuscript was propped up along the music rack on the piano, and several double sheets were spread open across the top. My dad had the fingers of his right hand spread wide, and he was holding down several notes at once. He lifted his hand, and then, keeping the same shape, played the notes again, and I saw his right foot hold down the right-hand pedal underneath. He lifted his hands from the keys, grabbed a pencil, and as the sound kept ringing in the room, he lightly whistled a few notes and wrote them on the stave. 5 saxophones, 4 trumpets, 4 trombones. Was there ever a better sound? He said, still looking at what he was writing, but clearly for my benefit. Then he span round on his stool and grinned at me, a big grin, the pencil between his teeth. And I sensed my mum come in behind me with a tray of tea, and she was grinning too. That evening, after I'd done my homework, he took me to the Ship Inn at Mortlake to celebrate. Though what we were celebrating, I wasn't quite sure. The pub sat right on the river's edge in the shadow of the vast brick, 8-storey Victorian maltings of the Watney's brewery. The maltings scared me. It loomed like a blank hulk above the towpath, featureless and threatening. I wondered how much grain must be piled high inside, soaking in the monstrous vats of water. When the tide was out, the foreshore was an oozing mud pit of stones and washed-up plastic debris. And if a mist had dropped low onto the water's surface, as it often did in the cold dusk of an approaching winter night, I half expected to see a lighterman or another river character I'd picked up from Dickens read aloud at school, sculling gently towards me, the rudder lines of his darkened boat slack in the turbid shallows. And yet, in spite of this, I got a thrill from being there and loved the moment of expectation as we made the final turn in the car down Ship Lane, not knowing if the tide would be out or in, and lapping at the very end of the road where we had to park, like a filthy tongue. We stood just above the foreshore at the pub, the sun melting behind the silhouettes of the trees on Duke's Meadows on the far side of the river. My dad seemed in a good mood. I was allowed a second Coke. He picked up an empty plastic bleach bottle from the flotsam washed up along the tide line, shook out the water and placed it on the corner of the brick embankment over to our left. Then he bent down and picked up a handful of pebbles and stones. "Hit it from 10 paces and I'll give you a quid," he said. A quid? I thought. He never gave me a quid. He must be in a good mood. I pictured my favourite toy shop in East Sheen and imagined what I could buy with it. Some Sabutio accessories, maybe, or a new yo-yo. He was throwing one of the pebbles up into the air and catching it repeatedly in the palm of his hand. I marked out 10 paces and took a pebble from him. "Best of 3, I said. He took out a cigarette, wrapped the end of it 3 times on the box and perched it on his lower lip. "If you like," he said, out of the corner of his mouth, half smiling. He took out his Ronson cigarette lighter. I liked his lighter a lot. It felt nice in the hand, the leather grip and the chrome burner. Sometimes he'd let me top it up from a small yellow gas cylinder, which hissed as you pushed down on the red spout and spilled clear fluid that evaporated from your fingers. He lit his cigarette, still looking at me. I sensed he was weighing me up. I took another 2 pebbles and lined up the first shot. A riverboat cruised through my eye line, its lights reflecting in the black steel water. I heard the gentle wash as the river slooshed onto the shore. I pulled back my shoulder, closed one eye, focused on the bottle, opened my eye again, and threw the pebble hard. It missed by some distance. I heard it land with a soft pock in the mud. My dad smiled wryly. "1 down," he said. "Yes, I know," I jumped in. 2 to go. I took the second pebble, was about to throw, then switched it for the other one in my hand, then switched back again. The second throw missed. I felt a hot flash in my chest. "Don't say anything," I said quickly. My dad stood there quietly, a low smile on his lips, half affectionate, half entertained. His hair was immaculately parted, a small badger's streak appearing in the swept-back, low quiff. He had one hand in his pocket, the other held the cigarette. He took a drag, briefly letting go of it, the orange tip intensified in the fading light, like embers caught in a draught. Then he took it again between his fingers and moved it down to his side and blew the smoke out in a long feathery plume from the corner of his mouth. The third pebble I just threw quickly. I didn't want to line it up and make it even worse than it was surely going to be by even trying to get it right. I just wanted to get rid of it. The pebble sailed through the air and, to my astonishment, grazed the side of the bottle. The bottle rocked on the stone wall for what seemed like forever, but then righted itself and didn't fall. "I hit it! I hit it!" "So you did. The quid's yours." He hadn't moved, still the same smile on his lips. "Tell you what, if I can hit it, I'll double it." I gasped. 2 quid. 2 quid. I thought of the pencils in the row on the gate leg table and my mum with the tray of tea. It must be good news, whatever it is, I thought. I opened my eyes wide and gazed at him. He bent over and scooped up a stone. He was 2 or 3 paces behind me. That made it at least 12 or 13 from the bottle. I stepped back. He stubbed out the final third of his cigarette, smearing it into the path with the sole of his shoe, and I heard the gravel grind. Then he pulled back his arm For a moment, he didn't look athletic at all. In fact, he looked somehow constricted. And I remembered how he never looked comfortable throwing a tennis ball. Often he just threw it underarm. And I thought of how he always pulled out of a tackle if we played football, and couldn't play badminton with me in the garden without making a jokey shot. He let fly with the pebble. As it left his hand, I lost it against the background of the huge brick wall of the maltings. It was as though it was a magic trick and he had made it disappear. He used to fool me and pretend he had found a sixpence behind my ear or had guillotined his thumb at the knuckle. And for a moment, I wondered if the pebble had vanished. The malting seemed massive in the thickening dusk, like a huge hole with the pewter sky above it. The pebble missed by a mile. I didn't know whether I was pleased or disappointed. Part of me had wanted him to smite the bottle into the river like a real dad. Part of me was pleased I had grazed it and he had missed. He straightened up and winked. "The 2 quid's yours anyway," he said. "It's our lucky day." Then he put his arm around me and we walked back to the car. "Your father's got a jazz orchestra again," he said. "We're back in business."
So you wrote this 17, 18 years after Patient. Why write a book now after all these years?
Both my parents appear in Patient, and they're quite memorable to people who've read that book. And when I wrote Patient, a lot of people said, "Your parents seem fascinating." They dealt with my illness in very different ways. My mother came to the hospital immediately, stayed with Tracy through all the dark times, stayed overnight in the relatives' room, didn't really understand anything of what was going on. Tracy had to fill her in, but she was as supportive as she could be in her strange, slightly distant way she's always had with me. My dad, on the other hand, couldn't cope with it at all. His jazz career was over at that point. He'd become pretty much a depressed alcoholic in his later years. He just couldn't cope with me being in hospital. And initially he wouldn't come and visit. So they were very strong characters, and I think I knew in a way I was going to have to confront their story at some point. And it just stayed there in the back of my mind, and when Everything But the Girl kind of came to a natural conclusion around 2000, Tracy wanted to start a family. I got very involved in underground electronic music for 10 years, got very fascinated in lyric-less music, instrumental music. But as that faded a little bit, I realised I wanted to get back to writing again. And this was about 4 years ago. And the first thing that came into my head was telling my parents' story. And my father had just died in 2006. And I discovered a huge box of letters and souvenirs that had been stored in my brother's loft, which my mother had kept. And I didn't really know anything about them, and my brother let me have them, and I took them home. And there was one particular box was all her love letters to my father during their affair in the late 50s. And a couple of the letters were sealed and said, "Private memories for Tom only." And I had a really difficult decision to make. My dad had just died. What do I do? Do I adhere to these wishes and burn it? Or do I open it and read them and perhaps have a better relationship with my mother if I could understand her relationship with my father? And that and natural curiosity brought me to open it. And of course that was the real kicker for the book, because that became the emotional heart of the book. And anyone who's read the book these letters play an increasingly important part, particularly towards the end of the book, where I tell the story of their affair and how they met. You get quite used to these cantankerous old people in the book, which dominates a lot of the story. And then I tell the story of their affair at the end. And that's, I think, where a lot of the power of the book lies for me.
Along the way, did you learn, what else did you learn about them? I mean, you were doing research, essentially, about their younger lives.
I think the thing that struck me most was that, I mean, we all have a bullet point idea of our parents' backstory. You know, we've seen the wedding photos, we've heard the Christmas anecdotes, we know their jobs they had. But of course, doing all the research and reading the letters, and I then went through public archives, and I did a huge amount of research on both their backstories. I started to realise the human scale of it all, and that they were just two flawed people trying to make the best decisions in their lives. And this involved a really awkward divorce, the collateral damage of children being let down, other partners, you know, losing out. And it suddenly became a very emotional story to me, not just the casual bullet point version that I'd grown up with. And I became very sympathetic towards them, because in their later years, they were difficult to deal with. They were old and a bit drunk and a bit depressed and a bit standoffish. And it would have been very easy to almost write off your relationship with them. And somehow this discovery of their story brought them to life as real people. And I realised that we all struggle with this shit all the time, you know, and whatever age you are, 20, 40, 60, 80, there are always difficult decisions to make. And I felt very sympathetic towards them.
I want to leave a little bit of time for everyone. I have one final question for you. With both of these books, obviously Patient, as I mentioned at the outset, where you're extremely graphic about your own body, and this, you're revealing a lot about your life and great intimacies, and that affect other people too, which is not necessarily the norm. I mean, maybe there are some people who don't like to see that out in the public. You know, was there a period where you had to say, should I write about this? Should I reveal all this? Should I talk so frankly about bowel movements or affairs or things like that? Especially maybe in your country, at least that's sort of the sense that you're supposed to be a little more discreet about it, not tell all.
I'm just interested in connection with people, you know, finding a common language. And the nittier and grittier it became, the realer it seemed. And I felt, if I feel this affected by these things, other people will do too. And it just, I didn't want to hold back, you know. I mean, there are dark sides to both stories, you know. You know, the body collapsing in the first book, and, you know, depression, which I suffered from myself a few years ago and was obviously in my family. I talk about that in the book. But realising that you have to kind of embrace the dark to make the most of the light, you know. And I think if I could fully express the darkness, it would make the lighter and the humorous passages of the book and the more upbeat sections that much more redolent, more vibrant. So that's why I did it. Maybe it's not very English of me, but I don't know. It just seemed like the best thing to do. It was funny, people often ask me, what do my brothers and sisters and stuff make of the book, because they appear in it sometimes. And Rowley, who's my half-brother, who helps me deal with my mother at the moment, who's still alive, by the way, she'll be 91 next week. I gave him a copy of the book in its draft stage. I said, just tell me what you think, because you're in it and it's coming out. And he picked me up from the station, we were driving in the car, we were chatting about stuff for a while, and then he said, yeah, I got the book. I said, oh, yeah, really? He said, yeah, yes, it's really good, yeah, great, well done. Anyway, here's a list of typos. I went, great, thanks, Riley. And then My second half-brother, Toby, I sent a copy to him. He doesn't read. He's not a reader at all. And he said, I haven't even read your first one. I said, well, look, I'm just giving it to you, you know, no obligation. I just feel you ought to have it. He went, okay, fine, I'll do my best. So I left it with him. And my third brother, who's the oldest half-brother I have, who's always been a bit of the family judge. I've been the youngest, and he's been the oldest. I sent it to him. He sent me an email straight back saying, got the book, really busy at the moment. We'll try and find a bit of time to read it, but thanks. And I went, okay, I'm sending this off to the proofreaders now, you know. Anyway, he finally got back to me about 6 weeks later at Christmas. And he said, finally got round to reading the book. Far too much to talk about now in an email, but here's a list of typos. So there you go, that's older siblings for you.
How would you describe the difference between music and literature in terms of the creative process?
Interesting, because since I wrote Romany and Tom, I've got back into solo songwriting again and released a record last year called Hendra, and I'm now trying to write another set of songs, which might be the follow-up. And what I've realised is common to both is you just do need a great idea. And when you find it, they do somehow write themselves. It's as though all the raw material for your outlook on a situation is all inside you, but it just needs a trigger point. It needs a good moment to tell the story, a good contradiction, something somebody says, a situation that seems both black and white. And you can go for weeks without finding one of those moments, and you think you'll never write anything again. And then suddenly somebody says something on a TV program, or you read a story in the paper, and the process is very fluid from that point. And for me, whether it's writing 3 verses and a couple of choruses in a song, or writing 20, 30 pages of prose, you need that. The fluidity comes from the idea, and once you're in the process, I don't know, I find it quite easy. It's getting started I find hard. You obviously have to be much more concise in a song.
Yeah.
You know, you're really paring down your ideas. Sometimes if I get an idea for a song, I write it in prose first. I write a short paragraph about what this song is going to be about, and then try and distill that a bit more, shorten the sentences, and then a sentence suddenly becomes just about long for a line of a song, and it's sort of a reductive process. So I don't know if that's an answer, but that's how it works for me.
Your memoirs are non-fiction, but your songs are inventive. Will you one day mix the two approaches and write a novel?
This is certainly something that Bloomsbury, my publishers, are very keen for me to do next. I mean, the first thing I'll say is that I do think in most cases the most successful songs that I've written they've started with an autobiographical kick to them. There's been something in my life that has happened to me specifically, or somebody I know, that has then caused the creation of the song. Because I think if you write completely from your imagination, it often starts well, but as Leonard Cohen said, you end up losing contact with the song somehow. It doesn't seem real, and certainly in my experience, the ones I look back on as my strongest songs have been from an autobiographical standpoint. But as for the novel idea, yes, I would like to have a go at it, but it's very different.
Yeah.
Non-fiction comes from a pre-written infrastructure that you then colour in.
Sure.
You know, novel writing, you have to dream it up yourself.
Quite.
So
More
we'll see.
challenging.
It's not a decision I'm taking lightly.
Our memories are full of gaps. Have you ever been tempted to embellish the past in your books?
It's an interesting question, and I think there is certainly a case to be made for the fact that this is a novelised non-fiction, and that's very much a style that I feel comfortable writing. I can remember certain situations, and I often use raw materials to get the facts right. I go back to letters, I go back to photographs. I pored over hundreds of photographs for this book. I go back to locations and revisit places I'm writing about. But then, when you've got all that detail correct, you still have to imagine precisely how those people felt and the conversations they had. You don't remember every word that was said. You remember a couple of lines that were exchanged. But perhaps you do have to embellish and write from the imagination to bring it to life. You know, it's not a document of literal fact, but it's a document of emotional fact. And I think you have to have the license, you know, to describe the light in a certain way, to bring the scene to life, even if you couldn't specifically remember whether it was raining or not. If it suits the mood of what you're writing, I think you're allowed to put that in, because it helps the truth of the book. So, yeah.